The feeling of shame. A Grail-inspired clarification, correction, and enlightenment. Preface. The need for clarity in an age of confusion. Humanity has entered an age where words have lost their weight, and concepts that once carried luminous meaning now lie distorted beneath layers of misunderstanding. Of all these distorted concepts, the human feeling of shame stands among the most gravely misunderstood. It has been misnamed, misused, condemned, glorified, weaponized, suppressed, and even celebrated in ways completely foreign to its true spiritual nature. Men and women of today carry burdens of shame they do not understand, while others move without any sense of shame at all, boasting of actions that should have awakened a quiet inner alarm within them. The pendulum swings dangerously between extremes, the shame that should exist but does not, and the shame that never should exist but does. This confusion creates inner wounds, moral paralysis, emotional heaviness, and spiritual disorientation. This book arises to dispel the fog. It seeks to open a clear path for those who have long suffered from shame that is false, unhealthy, or crippling, for those who have been taught to feel ashamed of what is noble or natural, for those who fear the opinions of others more than the will of their Creator, and equally for those who, having lost the capacity for righteous shame, now move through life without inner breaks, contributing to the moral and spiritual decay of their environment. Inspired by the clarity of the Grail Message, the teachings on spiritual laws, and the radiational reality governing the human spirit, this work aims to correct misconceptions passed down by culture, religion, and personal trauma. Reveal the true purpose of the feeling of shame as a spiritual safeguard. Show how shame becomes distorted when severed from the light. Guide the sincere seeker out of toxic shame into purification and clarity. Explain how noble shame protects honor, purity, and dignity. In a time when many seek escape from responsibility, and others drown in inward accusations, the light calls for balance, understanding, and awakening. Shame is not merely an emotion. It is not merely cultural conditioning. It is not merely social pressure. Shame is a spiritual signal, meant to serve the human being, but only when understood rightly. Therefore this book stands as a lantern for the earnest souls who yearn for truth about this misunderstood inner prompting. May it bring clarity where confusion reigns, strength where weakness hides, and healing where wounds have festered silently for too long. Introduction. Why humanity misunderstands shame, and why this book must correct it. Few inner experiences have caused more suffering, misunderstanding, and distortion in human life than shame. It has shaped childhoods, marriages, friendships, careers, cultures, religions, and even nations, yet almost no one truly understands its origin or purpose. In modern times, shame has been declared an enemy. Psychology teaches many to eliminate it entirely. Society encourages individuals to be shameless as a pathway to confidence. Even religion often weaponizes shame as a tool of control rather than a guide toward purity. Thus humanity is torn between false shame, which cripples the spirit, and the absence of rightful shame, which corrupts it. This book comes to illuminate the difference. The root of humanity's confusion. People misunderstand shame because they have lost connection to the spiritual laws that govern human existence. Once the connection to truth weakens, feelings, meant to be guiding instruments, become twisted, exaggerated, suppressed, or misdirected. Shame becomes a tool of manipulation, a wound that festers, a shadow that follows a person for decades, a crippling fear of judgment, a barrier to healthy expression, a source of self-hate, a mask worn to impress or hide, a cultural chain used to imprison souls. Yet shame was never meant to harm. It was given as a warning signal, a protective impulse, a spiritual break, prompting the human being to turn away from actions that violate inner purity, dignity, or harmony with the light. The two great errors about shame. Humanity's misunderstanding of shame splits into two major errors. Believing that shame in itself is evil and must be rejected. Believing that shame is a virtue in itself and must be cultivated in everything. Both extremes destroy the individual. A life without any sense of shame leads to moral hardness, recklessness, arrogance, and spiritual downfall. But a life governed by false shame leads to fear, timidity, emotional bondage, and self-rejection. The Grail-inspired understanding brings balance. Shame is only valuable when it arises from the spirit as a reaction to moral or spiritual violation. False shame, shame imposed externally or through ignorance, is an obstruction, not a purifier. Why this book must correct the confusion. Humanity today stands at the brink of a great purification, where everything untrue will fall away. To stand in this looming light, the human being must understand what shame is, what shame is not, when shame is a helper, when shame is a destroyer, how shame warns the spirit, how false shame poisons the spirit, how to free oneself from inherited or forced shame, how to cultivate noble shame that protects inner dignity. Without clarity, people will either cling to the wrong forms of shame or cast away the very impulse meant to shield them from downfall. A guide for those seeking healing, clarity, or reorientation. This book is written for those carrying deep, lifelong shame for things that were never their fault. Those ashamed of their gifts, identities, convictions, or moral choices. Those struggling with sexual, financial, social, or emotional shame. Those whose communities or families used shame to control, silence, or punish them. Those who feel no shame at all where they should feel it. Those whose conscience has grown dull. Those who wish to raise children with healthy, life-giving understanding. Those who wish to grow spiritually and align with the light. The Grail Message is a compass. The Grail Message does not attack shame nor glorify it. Instead, it reveals the laws behind it. It helps the seeker understand why the feeling exists, how it is formed, when it arises from the spirit, when it is merely psychological or cultural conditioning, how it relates to purity, honor, dignity, and inner truth, how to transform false shame into clarity and strength. The aim is not merely intellectual understanding. It is inner liberation. Part 1. The Origin and Nature of Shame. Understanding shame through the light of the Grail Message. Chapter 1. What is shame? A radiational definition. Humanity speaks of shame every day, yet understands almost nothing about it. Some use the word as a weapon for humiliation. Others interpret it as weakness. Many fear it, suppress it, or deny it. But only few know that shame is not merely an emotion. It is a radiational reaction, rooted in the deeper layers of the human spirit. To understand shame rightly, we must first set aside psychological theories, cultural interpretations, and societal conditioning. Shame did not begin with civilization. It is older than human language. It is woven directly into the spiritual structure of the human being, placed there as part of the Creator's protective mechanisms. Shame is the spirit's natural recoil from inner distortion. It is the light within nudging the human being whenever he steps outside the natural harmony of creation. It is the spirit's silent alarm, a healthy vibration that warns, this is not your path, this act is not in alignment with the light. Properly understood, shame is not condemnation. It is not judgment. It is not humiliation. Rather, it is the inner radar of purity, a gentle radiational signal designed to prevent spiritual damage. But because humanity today is entangled in wrong thinking, moral decay, and emotional disorder, shame has become twisted. It has been turned into something oppressive, fearful, and destructive. What was meant to protect has been weaponized to imprison. This book seeks to untangle that knot. In the light of the Grail Message, shame reveals itself as a warning vibration, not a punishment. A call to return to purity, not a tool for control. A mirror of the soul, not a shackle of fear. Shame exists to guide, not condemn. To correct, not crush. To lift, not destroy. And when humanity understands this once more, the feeling of shame will cease to be a burden and become what it was always meant to be, a guardian of spiritual dignity. Chapter 2. The Spiritual Origin of the Feeling of Shame. To understand the true origin of shame, we must rise far above the earthly plane, beyond the physical body, beyond the intellect, into the sphere of the spirit where the human being has his real home. Shame does not originate in the mind. It does not originate in culture. It does not originate in societal norms. It originates in the spiritual core of the human being, the eternal seed of life placed by the Creator. This core carries the qualities of purity, nobility, striving upward, and a natural orientation toward the light. Whenever a human being acts, thinks, or desires in a way that contradicts these spiritual qualities, a disharmony arises. This disharmony creates an immediate radiational disturbance. The spirit, being sensitive to purity, reacts with a sensation meant to alert: shame. Thus shame is not learned. It is innate. It is part of the spiritual equipment of every human being. This is why even a child, untrained in moral philosophy, can feel shame. Why people of every tribe, race, culture, and religion experience the same inner signal. Why shame appears even in solitude, when no eye sees and no human judge is present. Because the judge is within. Not as a condemning tyrant, but as a beacon of spiritual integrity. The Grail Message explains that the human spirit is surrounded by a radiational cloak, subtle coverings that vibrate according to the purity or impurity of a person's thoughts, words, and actions. When the vibration drops due to wrong living, the coverings become heavy, darkened, or compressed. This radiational disturbance presses upon the spirit, and shame is felt. Shame therefore arises from spiritual truth reacting against untruth. From inner purity reacting against impurity. From the light reacting against distortion. In its origin, shame is entirely noble. It is a sign that the spirit is still alive, still responsive, still capable of correction. A human being who no longer feels shame, no matter how wrong his actions are, is already spiritually numb. His coverings have become so dense that the warning signal can no longer penetrate. He walks the earth as one spiritually dead long before physical death arrives. To reclaim the true meaning of shame, humanity must return to this origin, where the feeling of shame is recognized as a spiritual compass, pointing the soul back to the will of the Creator. Chapter 3. Shame is a protective radiational mechanism. Shame was never meant to humiliate human beings. It was designed to shield them, spiritually, morally, and energetically. Just as pain protects the physical body from harm, shame protects the spirit from degradation. It signals danger in the invisible realms long before consequences unfold outwardly. It warns the human being before a wrong thought forms into a destructive habit. A wrong desire crystallizes into a harmful action. A wrong action sets in motion a chain of karmic consequences. Shame is the fire alarm of the soul, and like all alarms, it becomes loud only because the danger is real. 1. Shame protects purity. Purity has its own radiational frequency. It is light, clear, harmonious. When a person strays from purity, even by a little, the spirit feels the dimming of its own radiance. Shame appears to alert. Return. Your path is drifting downward. This protective mechanism is essential for spiritual growth. Without it, the human being would descend into moral chaos without any inner warning. 2. Shame protects dignity. True dignity is not pride. It is not arrogance. It is not societal status. Dignity is the natural radiance of a spirit aligned with the light. Shame protects this radiance by stirring discomfort whenever a person acts beneath his true spiritual worth. It whispers, "You are higher than this. Do not degrade yourself." Thus shame is the guardian of authentic human nobility. 3. Shame protects relationships. When properly understood, shame prevents the human being from harming others. It awakens empathy, responsibility, and restraint. It prevents betrayal, dishonesty, exploitation, and disrespect. Without shame, people would use one another as objects, ignoring consequences. Shame ensures that the human heart remains capable of compassion. 4. Shame protects spiritual pathways. Every wrong action creates threads, radiational ties, that pull the spirit into environments and experiences matching its state. Shame gives a warning before such ties become permanent. Like a shepherd's staff preventing a sheep from falling off a cliff, shame is the Creator's way of gently redirecting the human being toward safe spiritual ground. When shame becomes twisted, in its natural form, shame is light-filled and guiding. But once mixed with human ego, culture, fear, or manipulation, it becomes distorted. This leads to toxic shame, humiliation-based shame, inherited shame, shame imposed by others, shame unrelated to wrongdoing, All these are human inventions, not the shame originating from the light. One of the goals of this book is precisely to separate true shame, which protects, from false shame, which destroys. For when shame is rightly understood, it becomes not a burden but a blessing. Not a prison, but a pathway back to inner clarity. Chapter 4. The difference between true shame and false shame. Humanity today uses the word shame carelessly, applying it to almost every form of emotional discomfort, embarrassment, rejection, or social judgment. This confusion has darkened one of the most important spiritual mechanisms given to human beings for protection and upliftment. For shame, when rightly understood, belongs to the realm of the light. It is not the heavy, crippling burden many associate it with, but a luminous warning signal, a pullback from inner distortion. But there are two types of shame, true shame and false shame. One arises from spiritual lawfulness, the other is an artificial product of human error, culture, and fear. Humanity's suffering today comes mostly from false shame, an oppressive, binding feeling that attacks dignity rather than protecting it. The Grail Message provides the light needed to distinguish the two. True shame, a beacon of the light. True shame is a radiational reaction within the human spirit. It arises whenever a person acts, thinks, desires, or permits something that is not in harmony with the purity of the light. It is a signal, like the pain felt when touching fire. It warns, corrects, and guides. True shame is always pure, gentle, clear, immediate, protective. It is not noisy. It does not humiliate. It never crushes the spirit. It simply exposes misalignment so that the human being may step back and correct himself. Deep within, a person senses, this does not befit me as a human spirit. And in that moment of recognition, a doorway opens, one can return to purity, dignity, and uprightness. True shame pulls man away from spiritual danger. It is a gift, a safeguard placed within the soul to preserve nobility. False shame, the web of darkness. False shame is entirely different. It does not arise from spiritual lawfulness but from social pressure, cultural conditioning, fear of rejection, human opinion, inferiority or pride, trauma and distortion. False shame is a burden laid upon the soul by other human beings or by one's own distorted thinking. It is heavy, lingering, accusatory, and draining. It does not lead to correction but to suppression. It does not purify but enslaves. False shame makes a person hide from others, from himself, and from the light. It leads not to upliftment but to stagnation. Where true shame says, rise higher, false shame says, you are nothing. False shame is one of the tools of darkness, because it attacks the dignity of the spirit and binds it in self-loathing, fear, or paralysis. Many today live under the weight of false shame, mistaking it for conscience. How to distinguish the two? A simple test separates true shame from false shame. Does it lift you or crush you? Does it clarify or confuse? Does it inspire correction or bury you in helplessness? Does it come quietly and clearly, or with noise, fear, and humiliation? True shame is a guardian. False shame is a prison. The tragedy of the present humanity is that it rejects the one and embraces the other. The purpose of this book is to correct this reversal, to bring man back to the protective power of true shame and release him from the chains of false shame. Chapter 5. The purpose of shame in human development. In the radiant order of creation, nothing exists without purpose, not even the feelings human beings have come to misunderstand. Shame, when seen through the light of truth, plays a critical role in shaping the entire development of the human spirit. Shame is a boundary of dignity. Just as a river needs banks to maintain its direction and flow, the human spirit needs inner boundaries to prevent it from drifting into moral decay. Shame is one of these boundaries. It protects purity, honor, nobility, inner clarity, uprightness. Whenever a human being approaches a moral or spiritual boundary that would lead him into darkness, shame rises like a luminous alarm. It is the Creator's way of ensuring that his children do not plunge into spiritual degradation without warning. Shame is an inner compass. Human development depends on inner awakening. No law, no external teacher, no societal structure can replace the inner feeling that guides a person toward what is right. Shame contributes to this inner compass by making it impossible for the spirit to feel at ease when it deviates from the natural order of the light. This is why children who still possess purity respond instinctively to shame. Their spirits are still close to the light. But as humanity grows older and more morally corrupted, shame becomes dulled, ignored, silenced, or replaced by false shame. A spiritually mature person recognizes shame not as an enemy, but as a companion in growth. Shame and the process of refinement. Every human spirit on earth is on a journey of purification. Experiences, challenges, and encounters help refine the soul. Shame plays a crucial role in this process by highlighting unrefined tendencies, exposing wrong motives, and prompting self-examination. Without shame, refinement would be impossible. Without shame, the human being would never notice missteps until consequences struck. Without shame, the spirit would remain coarse, arrogant, unteachable. Shame makes inner refinement conscious. It brings awareness where there was blindness. It makes the human being responsible for his own development. Shame is a guardian of relationships. Many relationships today collapse not because of lack of love, but because shame has been lost. True shame prevents a person from speaking harshly, acting dishonorably, betraying trust, exposing what should remain private, committing acts unworthy of a human being. When shame is present, one pauses, reflects, and restrains impulses. It ensures that behavior aligns with dignity. A community where true shame is alive experiences harmony, one where it is dead sinks into chaos. Shame and spiritual strength. It may seem paradoxical, but one of shame's greatest purposes is that it teaches strength. Only a strong spirit can admit a mistake, feel shame, and correct its course. Those who reject shame reject growth. They become brittle, defensive, spiritually stagnant. Shame teaches humility, one of the greatest strengths of the human spirit. It opens the door to forgiveness, reconciliation, transformation. Humanity's loss of shame. Humanity today proudly declares, "I feel no shame," as though freedom were found in defiance. But in reality, this loss of shame is the greatest sign of inner collapse. For when shame dies, conscience begins to fade. When both fade, spiritual downfall is inevitable. The purpose of shame is to save the human being from such downfall. To revive true shame is to revive humanity. Part 2. How shame functions in creation. The laws that govern the human feeling life. Chapter 6. The law of attraction and shame's role in it. The law of attraction, as revealed in the structure of creation, is not a superficial idea of thinking something and receiving it. Rather, it is a spiritual law governing radiations, similarities, and the drawing together of homogeneous spiritual threads. Every human being radiates, continuously, irresistibly, and unmistakably. These radiations attract what corresponds to them and repel what is foreign. In this way, every person builds the conditions of his own environment long before his actions manifest outwardly. Shame itself emits a very distinct radiation. When it is true shame, arising from a violation of purity, honor, or natural spiritual dignity, its radiation is protective, drawing the individual away from danger, dishonor, or further descent. True shame attracts to a person the helpers, insights, and inner clarity needed for correction. It draws them upward. But when shame becomes false shame, rooted in fear of people, insecurity, pride, or emotional wounds, its radiation becomes clouded. It attracts confusion, unhealthy relationships, controlling influences, and circumstances that reinforce fear. False shame pulls downward. Thus shame participates in the law of attraction in two distinct ways. 1. True shame attracts purification. When the inner voice of shame momentarily stirs, it serves as a signal that something in one's feeling world is out of harmony with the light. This shame draws to the individual the exact experiences, warnings, or inner nudges that can guide them back onto the right path. The soul that responds openly becomes brighter, stronger, and wiser. 2. False shame attracts bondage. False shame draws experiences that strengthen the chains already present. It attracts humiliation, not because the person deserves it in a petty sense, but because the radiation of fear aligns with forces of intimidation and pressure. The individual becomes entangled in dependencies, pretending, hiding, and living beneath the natural freedom intended for the human spirit. 3. Shame reveals one's inner state. Whatever type of shame one experiences reveals the level of inner purity or impurity. True shame exposes missteps and points upward. False shame exposes inner weakness and points to unresolved wounds. Understanding this makes clear, shame is not an enemy. It is a radiational indicator, a compass needle swinging toward either healing or entanglement depending on its origin. Chapter 7. The Law of Reciprocal Action. Shame is a warning. The law of reciprocal action, also known as the law of sowing and reaping, is among the most misunderstood forces in human existence. Everything a person thinks, feels, says, and does returns to them in intensified form. This law is not punishment, it is justice woven into the fabric of creation, ensuring clarity, growth, and eventual purification. In this context, shame is a subtle first return wave from this law. Before the consequences of an action mature into a full harvest, shame often arrives as an early signal, giving the human spirit a chance to turn back before the sowing matures into painful reaping. 1. Shame is a mercy call of the law. True shame is often the first echo of an act, thought, or intention that is misaligned with the light. It warns the human being. Stop here. This path leads downward. This action tarnishes your inner dignity. This thought attracts consequences you do not want. Instead of waiting for bitter effects, shame gives the human spirit the opportunity to correct course while the consequences are still small and malleable. 2. How ignored shame leads to harsh consequences. When shame is ignored, silenced, or rationalized away, the individual sets themselves on a collision course with the matured repercussions of their own actions. The law of reciprocal action will not be mocked, it returns everything amplified. The gentle nudge becomes a heavy blow. Many people suffer today not because the world is unjust, but because they ignored the early whispers of shame, those soft warnings meant to prevent painful experiences. 3. False shame and misapplied reaping. False shame does not come from the law of reciprocal action. Instead, it arises from ignorance, cultural conditioning, fear of human opinions, childhood wounds, spiritual laziness, or emotional fragility. Because false shame is not rooted in truth, it produces no clarifying effects. Rather, it clouds perception and muddies the feeling world, making the true returns of the law hard to recognize. Thus, understanding shame's connection to this law allows one to distinguish truth from illusion. True shame comes to save, false shame comes to enslave. Chapter 8. The Law of Movement, How Shame Promotes Inner Purification. Movement is life in creation. Stagnation is spiritual death. The law of movement ensures that every human being grows, develops, and rises, or sinks, according to the movement of their inner life. Nothing remains still. Shame plays a significant role in this dynamic. 1. True shame creates forward movement. True shame is like a spiritual heat that forces the soul to move. It refuses to let the individual remain in a state of impurity or moral decay. It stirs restlessness, discomfort, and inner unease, not as torment but as a push to rise. This discomfort propels the person toward repentance, correction, restitution, new resolve, spiritual cleansing. In this way, true shame prevents stagnation. It is the engine of moral progress, the purifier of motives, the awakener of dormant conscience. 2. False shame creates paralysis. False shame disrupts the law of movement by causing inward contraction instead of upward striving. The person withdraws, hides, stops developing, or becomes spiritually numb. False shame leads to spiritual inertia, fear of self-examination, fear of others' opinions, avoidance of responsibility, emotional stagnation. The law of movement reacts harshly to such stagnation. Whatever does not move toward the light is swept into decline. 3. Shame is a catalyst for transformation. Human beings today often try to avoid shame at all costs. They distract themselves, numb their conscience, suppress their feelings, or surround themselves with people who affirm them even in wrongdoing. But in doing so, they reject a powerful catalyst for transformation. The Grail Message teaches that purification is indispensable for spiritual ascent. Shame, true shame, is among the most gentle instruments of this purification. It exposes what must be cleansed. It pushes the human spirit to strive for purity, dignity, and honor. 4. Movement toward the light. When shame is rightly understood, the individual no longer fears it. They welcome its presence as a sign that their inner life is alive, responsive, and capable of rising. The person who uses shame correctly becomes honest with themselves, courageous in correction, noble in conduct, free from inner clutter, attuned to the light. This is the path of upward movement. This is the purpose of shame within the structure of creation. Chapter 9. The radiations of purity and the reaction of shame. Shame cannot be understood apart from radiation, for everything in creation speaks through vibrations, tones, and correspondences. Shame is not born merely from human opinion or cultural norms. It emerges when the human soul encounters a higher purity than the state it presently carries within itself. Wherever the radiations of light fall, they penetrate and illuminate. They bring clarity, unveiling what is harmonious and what is distorted. These radiations are not judgmental, they simply reveal. They show each human being what he is, not what he pretends to be. When a person stands in the presence of purity, whether through a noble deed, an innocent child, a truthful word, or even in the silence of an uplifting atmosphere, the inner distortions begin to resonate sharply against this purity. This tension produces what human beings call shame. Shame, therefore, is the soul's natural reaction when lower vibrations are confronted by higher ones. It is not the light condemning the human being, it is the soul reacting to its own disharmony. The light only makes the difference visible. This is why shame can come suddenly, even without words. A person who has acted basely may, upon seeing an upright person or hearing a simple truth, feel a burning discomfort, a desire to withdraw or hide. Instinctively he senses, I am out of harmony with what stands before me. Thus the feeling of shame is directly connected to purity, the purity of the light and the purity of the laws that govern all being. It is also the reason why shame is absent in those who have sunk to spiritual numbness. Not feeling shame is never a sign of strength, it is a sign of inner degeneration, a loss of receptivity to higher radiations. A healthy person feels shame quickly, because a healthy soul is still sensitive to purity. The quicker the reaction, the more spiritually alive the person is. To understand shame, therefore, is to understand the simple truth. Purity awakens recognition. Recognition awakens discomfort. Discomfort awakens movement toward correction. The radiations of purity do not humiliate. They illuminate. They help the human being find his way home to clarity and rightness. In this sense, shame is a gift of the light, a compass pointing away from error and toward spiritual alignment. Without it, man would sink deeper into darkness without ever feeling what was amiss within him. Chapter 10. When shame awakens the conscience. Shame and conscience are deeply interconnected. Shame is the first stirring, the initial alarm, while conscience is the inner voice that interprets the alarm and gives it direction. Shame touches the surface of the soul, conscience penetrates deeper and speaks with authority. The conscience is not a human invention, nor is it the result of upbringing or cultural conditioning. According to the light of the Grail Message, the conscience is a spiritual organ, a receiver of the will of God within the human spirit. It hears and transmits what aligns with the laws of creation. However, this inner organ becomes dull when a person repeatedly acts against its impulses. The more frequently a person ignores the quiet warnings of conscience, the more weakened and muted it becomes, until it seems silent. Shame, however, can reawaken it. When a person experiences shame, it is as though a sudden shockwave runs through the soul, breaking through the layers of self-deception and excuses. What he refused to see now stands before him unmistakably. Shame forces him to acknowledge what conscience had been whispering all along. Thus shame serves as a bridge, a radiational shock that reconnects the human being to his conscience. It is often the first point of breakthrough after long periods of spiritual sleep. This is why shame often precedes sincere repentance. Not the shallow, forced repentance of social or religious expectation, but the deep, inward transformation that arises when the human being genuinely recognizes the wrong and feels compelled to rise above it. Shame may feel painful, but it is never destructive when it comes from the light. Destruction comes only from the human ego resisting the truth. When shame is allowed to do its work, it becomes a purifier, a clarifier, a motivator toward rectification, a restorer of inner dignity. But when shame is resisted, covered up, or suppressed, it turns into rebellion, arrogance, shamelessness, spiritual callousness. The very people who boast that they feel no shame are the ones farthest from spiritual health. They have silenced their conscience through continual transgression against the laws. The awakened human being, however, welcomes shame, not as humiliation but as revelation. He understands that shame is a sign of life within him, evidence that the conscience still functions. And the conscience, once awakened, will urge him forward into renewal. In this way, shame becomes not a stumbling block but a doorway, the doorway that leads from error to enlightenment, from distortion to harmony, and from spiritual sleep to spiritual awakening. Part 3. Misconceptions that distort the feeling of shame. Correcting humanity's most dangerous errors. Chapter 11. Shame is not sin, a needed correction. Humanity has wandered for too long under the burden of a dangerous confusion, the belief that the feeling of shame is itself a wrongdoing. In reality, the opposite is true. Shame is a gift, a spiritual impulse woven into the human spirit as a radiant alarm system. It is a signal, not a stain. Sin is an act, a deviation from the harmony of the laws of creation. Shame is a warning, an inner movement that precedes or follows an act in order to restore harmony. To equate the two is a tragic spiritual error. Shame arises from the radiations of purity that permeate creation. When the human spirit approaches a boundary, a deviation, or a lowering of vibrational alignment, shame flares up, not to condemn, but to redirect. It is like the warmth one feels upon nearing fire. The sensation is not the injury, it is the protection from injury. Only a morally and spiritually alive person can feel shame. The spiritually dead feel nothing. Therefore shame is proof of conscience still responsive, purity still active within, inner sensors still functioning, a connection upward still intact. To silence shame is to sever oneself from the light-filled warning system creation placed within man. To confuse shame with sin is to despise a tool given for salvation. Shame is not something to fear, it is something to understand. And when understood, it becomes a compass pointing back to purity. This chapter lifts the first veil. You cannot heal from shame if you believe shame itself is evil. You cannot grow if you reject the very mechanism designed to guide growth. Chapter 12. The error of equating shame with weakness. Another grave misunderstanding that engulfs humanity is the belief that feeling shame is an expression of weakness, fragility, or inferiority. Entire cultures mock, suppress, or punish this feeling. Men are told they must never show it. Women are told it is a flaw. Children are shamed for feeling shame. The result is a spiritually crippled generation. This error stands in direct contradiction to the laws of creation. Shame is not weakness, it is sensitivity to purity. Only what still possesses inner sensitivity can feel the friction that arises when purity touches impurity. The insensitive feel nothing, not because they are strong, but because they are dull, hardened, spiritually numb. Iron, when struck, rings. Clay, when struck, gives no sound. So too does the human spirit. The pure or striving spirit resonates under the touch of higher radiations. The calloused spirit does not. The strong are those who can feel, deeply, clearly, truthfully. In creation, strength is not the suppression of feeling but the upright mastery of feeling. The strong man is not the one who hides shame but the one who allows it to instruct him. Weakness lies in running from shame, covering it, burying it beneath pride, defiance, or pretense. Such avoidance drives the spirit downward because the warning mechanism is ignored. Strength lies in facing what shame reveals, acknowledging the deviation, restoring the inner balance, realigning with the light. When shame activates and the person responds with humility, honesty, and willingness to change, a powerful inner renewal occurs. This is the path to true strength. Thus, shame is not a flaw but a refining fire. Only those with living strength can endure its heat and emerge purified. Chapter 13. the misconception of shame as a social condition. The modern age has turned shame into a social construct, something imposed by society, culture, or public judgment. As a result, millions believe that shame comes from the opinions of people. But this is a shallow distortion. True shame does not originate in society, it arises from radiational realities within creation. What society calls shame is often merely embarrassment, fear of criticism, or the desire to maintain an image. This is false shame, born of human expectations, not spiritual truth. True shame, however, occurs even when no one is watching. It appears when the inner being brushes against a deviation from purity, even in secrecy. It arises from within and is untouched by public approval or disapproval. A person may be praised by society and yet feel shame internally because the act contradicts higher laws. Another may be condemned by society and feel no shame because the act was aligned with truth. This alone proves that true shame is not social. Society can manipulate feelings, but it cannot create or destroy the sacred inner mechanism of shame. What many fear today is not shame but social exposure. And social exposure has nothing to do with the genuine spiritual function of shame. The tragedy is that when shame is reduced to a social phenomenon, humanity tries to cure it by removing moral boundaries, denying responsibility, normalizing impurity, silencing conscience, glorifying shamelessness as empowerment. This suppression destroys the very inner compass meant to protect the human spirit. The more society tries to eliminate shame, the deeper it sinks into confusion, moral decay, and spiritual darkness. True shame does not bind, it protects. False shame enslaves, true shame liberates. False shame is imposed externally, true shame radiates from within. To distinguish the two is to reclaim purity. To confuse them is to walk blind in a world that requires the eyes of the Spirit. Chapter 14. How Religion Misused Shame. Distortion through ignorance of the laws. Shame, in its pure and original form, is a protective spiritual reflex. It rises when the human spirit approaches what is impure, disharmonious, or unworthy. It was intended by the Creator as a guardian, not a weapon. Yet throughout history, religion, especially when detached from spiritual enlightenment, has misused shame as an instrument of control, fear, and submission. This misuse arose because religious leaders themselves lost the understanding of the laws of creation. Instead of guiding human beings to inner ennoblement through free, conscious recognition of the truth, institutions found it easier to impose shame from without. Thus the sacred inner warning became twisted into an external pressure. 1. Shame turned into coercion. Many religious bodies, unable to ignite inner conviction, resorted to behavioral policing. Actions that differed from their doctrines were not met with explanation or enlightenment, but with public disgrace. Shame, which should arise within a person when they deviate from purity, was replaced with fear of punishment and fear of men. This is false shame. It does not refine, it suppresses. 2. Shame weaponized to control the masses. Instead of uplifting humanity, shame became a tool to enforce obedience, maintain hierarchy, silence inquiry, suppress individuality, and keep people bound to an institution rather than to God. This form of manipulation drives human spirits away from natural development and replaces inner awakening with blind conformity. 3. The consequences of religious distortion. Where shame is misused, genuine inner growth collapses. People obey outwardly while decaying inwardly. Guilt becomes chronic and irrational. And souls become crippled instead of strengthened. Misused shame pushes humans into fear, self-loathing, or rebellion, not into purity. And thus the sacred function of shame is buried beneath centuries of misinterpretation. 4. The Grail Message's correction. The Grail Message restores clarity. Shame is meant to protect the human spirit from impurity, not to condemn it for being human. It is an inwardly experienced radiational reaction to the laws of light, not a tool for priests, elders, or doctrines to control conduct. True shame arises silently and nobly. It is deeply personal. No one can force it. No one can legislate it. No one can produce it in another through fear. Religion misused shame because it lost the connection to the living will of God, which demands freedom, responsibility, genuine recognition, and inner conviction. This chapter calls humanity back to that path. Chapter 15. How Modern Psychology Mistakenly Eliminated Shame. The opposite distortion in an age of overcorrection. Where religion once misused shame, modern psychology has gone to the opposite extreme. It has declared shame unnecessary, unhealthy, and harmful, branding it as an emotion to be cured, removed, or suppressed. In its zeal to free humanity from false shame imposed by society or religion, psychology has unintentionally thrown away the essential, healthy form of shame, the very form that guards the soul and maintains purity. 1. The denial of spiritual emotions. Modern psychology, rooted in materialistic worldviews, does not recognize the spiritual core of the human being, the radiations of purity, the laws of reciprocal action, or the protective mechanisms woven into creation. Since it sees humans only as biological creatures shaped by environment, it naturally concludes that shame is entirely cultural and therefore disposable. This is a grave error. 2. Healthy shame versus psychological interpretation. Psychology teaches that shame creates low self-esteem, social anxiety, depression, and relational dysfunction. But what it calls shame is often humiliation, social pressure, externally induced guilt, or trauma from judgmental environments. These are not true shame. These are humanity's distortions. In trying to heal people from those distortions, psychology mistakenly lumps them together with the healthy, God-given form of shame that arises from deviation from purity, selfish actions, dishonorable intentions, or inner impurity. 3. The spiritual danger of eliminating shame. When genuine shame is denied or suppressed, the conscience becomes dull, wrongdoing increases, boundaries dissolve, immorality spreads, and human beings begin to justify even the impure as authentic self-expression. This age celebrates shamelessness as confidence. It celebrates impurity as liberation. It celebrates the destruction of boundaries as openness. Yet the human spirit cannot flourish without reverence for purity, dignity, and inner order. Shame is the natural inner response that awakens this reverence. 4. Psychology's noble intention but misguided approach. Psychology sought to heal the wounds caused by centuries of religious misuse. This intention was good, but lacking spiritual knowledge, it replaced misuse with denial. Instead of restoring the true nature of shame, it declared all shame toxic. Thus humanity lost an essential compass. 5. The Grail Message's restoration. The Grail Message reveals true shame as part of the spiritual immune system of the human being. Without it, the soul becomes exposed to impurity, just as a body without immune response becomes vulnerable to disease. This book calls for a balanced correction. Free humanity from false shame. Restore and honor true shame. This is the path back to inner health. Part 4. False shame, the shadow of the human intellect. How wrong thinking distorts a pure spiritual function. Chapter 16. Shame from fear of people, not fear of wrong. False shame begins the moment the human being shifts his axis of orientation from the light, which alone gives true direction, to the opinions of human beings, which are unstable, inconsistent, and often misguided. True shame arises when a person violates purity, nobility, or inner truth. It stirs the conscience, awakens the sleeping spirit, and turns the gaze upward toward rectification. But false shame is different. It makes the human being look sideways, left and right, toward human expectation, external judgment, and social approval. Many today fear embarrassment more than wrongdoing. They guard their image more than their soul. They hide mistakes not because they feel remorse, but because they dread human opinion. This inversion darkens the radiations within them. For whenever the spirit loses its alignment with the light, its perceptions become distorted. The Grail Message teaches that only what is rooted in truth can uplift. False shame never uplifts, it enslaves. It makes a person timid where they should be bold, silent where they should speak, and defensive where they should simply repent and rise renewed. The one enslaved by fear-driven shame remains stuck in stagnation, unable to develop. But the one who breaks free from the gaze of the crowd and seeks only the will of God soon understands that shame was given for salvation, not for captivity. When shame is directed toward the light, it becomes a key to release. When directed toward man, it becomes a chain of bondage. Chapter 17. The paralyzing power of intellectualized shame. The intellect, when allowed to dominate the spirit, creates a counterfeit version of many natural spiritual functions, including shame. This counterfeit shame is analytical, exaggerated, self-centered, and rooted in mental constructs rather than inner truth. Instead of being a clear, simple, and pure feeling that warns against deviation from the light, intellectualized shame becomes a complicated mental storm. What will people think? How will this appear? What will this say about my status, identity, or image? The intellect tries to calculate shame, then magnifies it. It reads motives into the actions of others, assumes judgment where none exists, and projects condemnation from imagined observers. This creates paralysis. Many no longer act from conviction but from fear of missteps. They shrink from new opportunities, hide their gifts, suppress their voice, and even avoid natural human interactions, all because the intellect has constructed a fragile ego that cannot bear exposure. This is not the shame God placed in human souls. It is a distortion. The Grail Message explains that the intellect is merely an instrument for shaping earthly forms. It is not the seat of morality, purity, or spiritual perception. Thus, when the intellect attempts to manage emotions designed for the spirit, it inevitably corrupts them. Intellectualized shame freezes growth. True shame frees it. The former closes the soul in fear, the latter opens the soul to renewal. To escape this paralysis, a person must restore the rightful hierarchy. Spirit above intellect, truth above image, light above fear. Chapter 18. False shame in children and adults. False shame often begins in childhood, not because children naturally possess it, but because it is taught, projected, and reinforced by adults who themselves misunderstand the feeling. A child is shamed for speaking honestly, shamed for expressing curiosity, shamed for being excited, emotional, or expressive, shamed for making innocent mistakes, shamed for qualities that are actually natural stages of development. Thus, instead of learning true shame, which warns against impurity, they learn false shame, which warns against being themselves. The adult who grew up under such distortions carries hidden wounds. Fear of criticism. Fear of being noticed. Fear of trying. Fear of failure. Fear of disappointing others. Many adults walk through life apologizing for existing, not knowing why. False shame steals courage. It dims talents. It weakens the will. It creates adults who hide their own radiance. But the human spirit was never meant to hide. It was created to stand upright, joyful, luminous, and active within creation. When false shame is removed, the soul straightens as though a burden has been lifted. A natural confidence, rooted not in pride but in truth, begins to bloom. Healing begins the moment a person learns to recognize. This shame is not mine. It was imposed upon me. Once that recognition dawns, the soul begins to breathe again. Chapter 19. The hidden roots of false shame in the human ego. False shame has a subtle origin, the ego. The ego fears humiliation, correction, exposure, and even guidance. It wants to appear flawless. It craves admiration. It wants others to perceive it as competent, strong, perfect, or special. Because of this, it uses shame not as a tool for purification but as a shield for self-preservation. This is why false shame reacts strongly even when no wrong has been done. A person may blush or panic when corrected gently, not because the correction was harsh, but because the ego feels threatened. Another may hide their struggles because admitting them feels like defeat. Others avoid asking for help, making mistakes, or learning in public. The ego fears vulnerability, but the spirit grows through it. The Grail Message exposes the ego as a product of intellectual dominance and spiritual laziness. It thrives only where there is inner emptiness. True shame dissolves ego, false shame protects it. When a person begins to dissolve the ego through humility and truthfulness, false shame loosens its grip. The spirit begins to rise and operate with clarity. Correction becomes welcome. Growth becomes possible. Openness becomes natural. False shame is the ego's armor. True shame is the spirit's compass. Chapter 20. How Society Manufactures Artificial Shame. In today's world, artificial shame is manufactured and distributed like a product. Society defines what is acceptable, trendy, respectable, desirable, or normal, and then shames all who fall outside these shifting illusions. People are shamed for their appearance, shamed for poverty, shamed for wealth, shamed for their background, shamed for being different, shamed for not conforming to the expectations of the crowd. This is not shame, it is conditioning. It enslaves the human spirit by tying identity to external approval. It replaces inner values with societal trends. It produces masses who think alike, act alike, dress alike, and fear the same fears. Artificial shame forces people to chase validation instead of truth. The Grail Message warns that the human being must never allow external influences to dictate his inner life. Each soul must align with the will of God, not the shifting values of a confused humanity. When a person stands firmly in the light, the artificial shame imposed by society falls away like smoke. It cannot bind one who knows who they are and whose laws govern life. The liberated soul walks upright, unbothered by ridicule, immune to mockery, and anchored in truth. Such a person becomes a living rebuke to a world that worships superficiality. Artificial shame collapses wherever true self-knowledge begins. Part 5. The Consequences of Misused or Suppressed Shame. Why Humanity Suffers Emotionally, Morally, and Spiritually. Chapter 21. The Inner Damage from Suppressing Shame. There is hardly a spiritual function more misunderstood in today's world than shame. And yet, this very misunderstanding has caused humanity to bury, silence, and override one of the Creator's most protective inner mechanisms. Shame was never meant to be suffocated. It was given to man as a radiational response, a subtle inner alarm that vibrates in the soul when it begins to deviate from purity. It is a signpost, not a punishment. But modern man, inflated with intellect and poisoned with pride, often treats shame as an enemy, a nuisance, or an outdated relic. Instead of listening to it, he pushes it down. Instead of learning from it, he numbs it. Instead of correcting himself, he silences the voice that urges correction. Suppressed shame does not disappear. The human soul cannot rid itself of an inner process designed by the laws of creation. What is suppressed simply retreats into the subconscious where it continues to radiate, not upward, as it should, toward purification, but downward, fermenting, distorting, and creating inner heaviness. When shame is suppressed, the conscience becomes dull. The sensitivity of the spirit weakens. The inner compass loses accuracy. The soul becomes restless but does not understand why. This inner disturbance is what many call anxiety, unease, or emptiness, but spiritually it is often the cry of a soul that has muted a necessary warning signal. Suppression of shame leads to fragmentation within the human being. A person begins to live at odds with themselves, outwardly projecting composure, inwardly carrying tension. It is a divided existence. And a divided spirit cannot rise. Those who suppress shame eventually lose the ability to distinguish between what is noble and what is base. They begin to justify actions that earlier they would have rejected. They reinterpret wrong as personal freedom, and they interpret discipline as oppression. They lose the inner softness that keeps the soul receptive to the light. Thus, the first tragedy of suppressed shame is the spiritual dulling of the human being. A person becomes spiritually numb, not evil, not wicked, simply unresponsive. But a numb soul cannot grow. And once shame is extinguished, the path toward moral decline is already set. Chapter 22. Shame Turned Inward, Self-Hatred and Guilt. When the feeling of shame is misunderstood or misdirected, it can turn inward and become something it was never meant to be, self-hatred. True shame points toward wrongdoing. False, inverted, or suppressed shame points toward the person. Instead of, this action was not in harmony with the light, the distorted inner voice says, I am worthless, I am inherently flawed, I am beyond repair. This corruption of meaning is the work of the overactive intellect and its cousin, self-will. The intellect, once cut off from higher guidance, turns shame into a verdict against the individual, not a nudge toward correction. This is how spiritual warning becomes emotional torture. Shame turned inward becomes chronic guilt, feelings of inadequacy, emotional paralysis, perfectionism, self-sabotage, fear of being seen. But none of these feelings arise from the spiritual function of shame itself. They are perversions of it caused by the lower tendencies of the human being. The Grail Message teaches that every pure spiritual function can be distorted by the intellectual volition of man. Shame is no exception. The intellect, which cannot comprehend radiational processes, turns what is meant to guide into something that condemns. The result is people who attack themselves for mistakes rather than rise above them, people who drown in regret instead of learning from their errors, people who wear guilt like a cloak and wonder why they feel far from God. Yet the truth is simple. Shame is not meant to bind you. It is meant to release you, by pointing you to what must be set right. A person who understands shame correctly never lives in guilt. They live in clarity. Guilt is the stagnant pool of unresolved wrong. Shame, properly understood, is the wind that urges you toward cleansing. Those who turn shame inward block this cleansing. They hold tightly to the very thing they were meant to discard. They imprison themselves emotionally and spiritually. And in this state, they cannot receive light. The soul becomes surrounded in a fog of self-created heaviness. To correct this, humanity must learn again. Shame is a guidepost, not a grave. It condemns nothing, it only reveals what needs purification. Chapter 23. Shame turned outward, aggression and arrogance. When shame is not suppressed internally, some individuals deflect it outward. Instead of facing their errors, they attack others. Instead of acknowledging their own deviation from purity, they blame, accuse, criticize, or demean. This outward projection of shame often appears as anger, defensiveness, irritability, superiority, mockery, contempt. Such people sense the stirring of shame within but cannot tolerate it. Instead of turning toward the light, they turn against their fellow human beings. This is how arrogance is born, not from strength, but from fear. Much of what passes for confidence today is actually the shielding of an unprocessed feeling of shame. The loudest, most aggressive people are often those who secretly fear the most. Shame has tried to guide them, but they have refused its guidance. And so they protect themselves with hostility. This is the origin of many social conflicts, many broken relationships, many abusive behaviors. The Grail Message teaches that no soul can rise unless it is willing to face itself. But modern humanity would rather face anything except itself. Aggression is often a defense against inner seeing. Arrogance is often a cover for inner insecurity. Mockery is often the weapon of those who cannot endure the mirror of truth. Because shame was meant to signal deviation, any attempt to silence it must be accompanied by increasing force. The person becomes hardened, they become closed, they become unreachable, and eventually, they enter a radiational state that repels light and attracts what is dark and heavy. Thus, the outward misdirection of shame creates spiritual isolation. A person who cannot accept correction cannot receive grace. They can no longer be taught. They cannot grow. They fortify themselves behind walls of pride. And every wall erected against truth becomes a prison. Chapter 24. The Loss of Moral Sensitivity in a Shameless Generation. We live in a time predicted long ago in spiritual writings, a time when humanity would lose its inner compass. A time when shamelessness becomes celebrated, even admired. A time when true shame is ridiculed, and false shame is cultivated. A time when moral sensitivity is no longer seen as strength but as weakness. A shameless generation is a spiritually deaf generation. Look around. Young people boast of behavior that earlier generations would hide. Virtue is mocked as old-fashioned. Modesty is seen as insecurity. Correction is interpreted as judgment. Repentance is dismissed as weakness. This moral inversion is not accidental. It is the result of decades, even centuries, of humanity silencing the inner signals designed to keep it aligned with the light. When the feeling of shame is consistently ignored, the soul becomes insensitive. This insensitivity gives rise to moral confusion, normalization of vice, celebration of vulgarity, weakening of conscience, loss of reverence for what is pure, inability to feel remorse. Without shame, humans no longer blush at wrongdoing. They justify everything through intellect, culture, or personal preference. They call impurity, expression, immorality, freedom, irresponsibility, choice. But in doing so, they distance themselves from the radiations of light, which require softness, openness, and receptivity. Where there is no shame, there can be no transformation. Where nothing touches the conscience, nothing can awaken it. Where no inner alarm rings, the soul walks blindly into destruction. Thus, a society that kills shame is a society that kills its future. Chapter 25. How the death of shame leads to societal collapse. When shame dies in the individual, degeneration begins. When shame dies in the collective, collapse begins. Shame is not merely a personal feeling, it is a social regulator, a spiritual protective mechanism woven into the fabric of human coexistence. It keeps communities upright, families strong, and nations stable. When shame dies, corruption increases. Dishonor becomes normal. Immorality spreads. Irresponsibility becomes a culture. Leadership becomes self-serving. Exploitation grows unchecked. Justice becomes arbitrary. Violence escalates. A society without shame cannot sustain integrity because shame is the inner guardian that prevents man from abusing his freedom. Historically, every civilization that lost its sense of shame descended into moral decay, confusion, and eventual dissolution. Not because of external enemies, but because the inner foundation crumbled. The Grail Message reveals that all collapse begins first in the radiational sphere, long before physical destruction becomes visible. The death of shame darkens this sphere. It fills the atmosphere with spiritual pollution. The collective conscience becomes clouded. The laws of light respond, not punitively, but mechanically. A shameless society becomes vulnerable to chaos, instability, collapse of institutions, breakdown of trust, spiritual famine. Without shame, the protecting veil around society disintegrates, and destruction enters through the gaps. Humanity must understand. Shame is not an enemy of joy. Shame is an enemy of corruption. Where shame is allowed to fulfill its function, purity strengthens. Where purity strengthens, light descends. Where light descends, harmony flourishes. Thus, the revival of shame, true, pure, spiritual shame, is not only the healing of the individual soul but the salvation of nations. Part 6. The healing of shame through spiritual awakening. Aligning the human soul with the laws of creation. Chapter 26. Recognizing the first stirring of true shame. True shame does not begin with fear, embarrassment, or social exposure. These belong to the realm of false shame. The first stirring of true shame arises silently and inwardly, like a soft but unmistakable radiational touch upon the soul. It is a spiritual reaction to impurity, a natural recoil of the inner being when it approaches what is unworthy, unclean, or out of harmony with the will of the Creator. This first stirring is not loud. It never shouts. It never forces. It simply alerts. It arises as an inner resistance to moral decline, a gentle heat of discomfort that signals, this path is not right for you. Many people mistake it for guilt, fear of judgment, or social anxiety. But true shame exists independently of human opinions. It responds only to truth, purity, and the spiritual laws. Every human being has felt this awakening at least once, before the intellect drowned it out, before pride suppressed it, before society mocked it. In childhood, it was strongest. The recoil from lying, the hesitation before cruelty, the discomfort at deception. But as adulthood came, many silenced this voice to fit in, to survive, or to appear strong. Recognizing this stirring again is the first step toward healing. It requires stillness, honesty with oneself, and the quiet courage to acknowledge. There is something within me that recoils from what is not right. This recognition marks the rebirth of spiritual sensitivity. It is the return of the soul to its original orientation, toward the light, toward purity, toward truth. Once a person welcomes this stirring instead of resisting it, true healing begins. For this inner response is not an enemy, it is a gift. It is creation lovingly calling the human spirit back into harmony. Chapter 27. Awakening the Conscience. The conscience is not a product of culture, upbringing, or psychology. It is a spiritual organ, woven into the human soul, designed to vibrate in accordance with the laws of creation. It warns, guides, reminds, reproves, and illuminates. But when true shame is ignored or suppressed, the conscience becomes muted, clogged, and eventually dormant. To awaken the conscience again, one must first quiet the intellect, for the intellect, when dominant, becomes a thick veil over spiritual sensitivity. The conscience cannot be reasoned into existence, nor can it be forced. It must be allowed to rise, like a forgotten melody that begins to play once noise is removed. Awakening the conscience requires 3 steps. Honest self-reflection. Without excuses, without blame shifting, without fear of what may be revealed. This is not self-condemnation, it is clarity. Receptivity to light. The more a person seeks what is noble, pure, truthful, and uplifting, the more strongly the conscience vibrates. Obedience to inner knowing. When the conscience speaks, even faintly, it must be followed. Every act of obedience strengthens it. Every act of rebellion weakens it. As the conscience awakens, shame regains its rightful place, not as a weapon of destruction but as a guardian of purity. Conscience and true shame work together as a spiritual compass, guiding the human being along paths aligned with the Creator's will. This awakening restores moral clarity in a world drowning in intellectual darkness. Chapter 28. The Role of Purity in Healing Shame. Purity is not naivete, weakness, or ignorance, it is a radiational state of clarity, luminosity, and inner harmony. It aligns the human spirit with everything noble, uplifting, and true. In the presence of purity, distorted shame dissolves, and true shame becomes sharp, clear, and deeply protective. Purity heals shame in 3 profound ways. It disperses the fog of confusion. When a person strives for purity, through honest intentions, clean thoughts, sincere motives, the inner clarity returns. Confusion about shame disappears like mist before the sun. One simply knows what is right. It restores proper radiational sensitivity. Purity strengthens the soul's ability to recognize spiritual vibrations. One begins to distinguish between true shame, a reaction to spiritual impurity, and false shame, a reaction to human opinion or pride. It rebuilds dignity. Purity lifts the human being out of the mud of self-hatred, unworthiness, and guilt. It restores self-respect, not through ego, but through alignment with the light. True dignity arises, not from wealth or praise, but from the certainty that one is walking in harmony with the laws of creation. In a world where impurity is normalized and shamelessness is celebrated, the path of purity becomes the only true remedy. Purity does not suppress shame, it refines it. Purity does not eliminate shame, it positions it as a guardian and guide. Where purity grows, shame becomes a blessing. Chapter 29. How to distinguish true shame from false shame. Many suffer today not because of shame itself, but because they cannot distinguish between its true and false forms. This confusion leads to unnecessary pain, moral paralysis, or reckless shamelessness. The Grail-inspired clarity exposes the fundamental differences. True shame arises from the spirit, responds to wrong, impurity, dishonor, and moral decay, strengthens conscience, leads to correction, repentance, and growth, aligns one with the light, protects dignity, promotes humility. False shame arises from ego or fear, responds to human opinion, gossip, judgment, or social rejection, weakens conscience, leads to hiding, lies, or self-condemnation, aligns one with the intellect, destroys dignity, promotes pride or self-hatred. True shame makes one better. False shame makes one smaller. True shame leads upward. False shame pulls downward. True shame is noble. False shame is destructive. Learning to distinguish these two is one of the greatest steps toward spiritual maturity. And once the distinction becomes clear, a person can finally reject the false shame that has enslaved them for years while embracing the life-giving correction of true shame. Chapter 30. The Rebirth of Dignity Through Inner Awakening. Healing shame is not merely the removal of pain, it is the restoration of dignity. True dignity comes not from achievements, status, wealth, or admiration but from alignment with the will of the Creator. A person regains dignity when the conscience awakens. True shame guides choices. False shame loses its power. Purity becomes the inner compass. The spirit stands upright again. This dignity is not pride. It is not self-glorification. It is the quiet strength of a soul that knows where it belongs in creation, beneath the light, upheld by truth, guided by love. This rebirth of dignity is the ultimate healing of shame. For dignity gives courage, it gives direction, it gives inner stability, it enables a human being to walk through life without fear of judgment, without bondage to opinions, and without the crippling effects of false shame. The awakened human being stands as they were meant to stand. Upright, clear, receptive to truth, protected by true shame, and radiant with the dignity bestowed by the Creator. Part 7. Shame is a path to nobility and maturity. The light-filled purpose of this misunderstood feeling. Chapter 31. Shame is guardian of honor. Every human being carries within the spiritual core a delicate sense of honor, an inner nobility woven into the very nature of the human spirit. Honor is not taught, nor can it be artificially instilled through culture or discipline. It is an innate spiritual knowing, a resonance that reacts immediately whenever the human being approaches what is unworthy, low, or dark. Shame is the radiational response of this inner honor. When a person intends, plans, or begins to engage in something beneath the dignity of the spirit, shame stirs. It rises not as an enemy, but as a friend, an inner guardian standing at the threshold of one's spiritual integrity. In the light of the Grail Message, shame is a warning vibration, a luminous reaction of the purer layers of the soul pushing back against intrusion from the lower instincts or errant desires. It is similar to how the body recoils instinctively from a burning flame. Shame is the soul's recoil from moral or spiritual danger. Where honor is alive, shame is active. Where honor is dormant, shame becomes faint. Where honor is dead, shame disappears altogether. Humanity's tragedy is not that people experience shame, but that so many no longer can. A person who still feels shame is not weak, but spiritually alive. The capacity for shame is evidence that honor still breathes within them, whispering, "You are meant for more than this." Shame is not the enemy of the human being, it is the protector of their nobility. It ensures that the human spirit does not lose itself in the mud of intoxication, immorality, deceit, or any form of inner degradation. It is the light's gentle, but firm, intervention. When this guardian voice is heeded, the individual grows upright, sound, and strong. When ignored, it grows faint. When silenced, the person sinks into spiritual darkness. Thus the first step toward regaining honor is not to reject shame, but to listen to it. Chapter 32. Shame is the doorway to uprightness. Uprightness is not a posture of the body but a condition of the soul. It marks the transition from spiritual childhood to mature human expression. Shame stands at the very threshold of this transformation. Contrary to human tradition, uprightness does not begin with knowledge, discipline, or religious instruction. It begins with the human being's willingness to feel shame deeply, and respond to it truthfully. Shame reveals where one has gone off course. Humility acknowledges the truth of that revelation. Uprightness is the decision to return to the right path. This is why the Grail Message describes shame as a purifying flame. Its task is not to condemn but to illuminate. It shows the soul the gulf between what it is doing and what it should be doing according to the will of the Creator. A person becomes upright the moment they say, "This is beneath me as a creature of the light. I turn away from it." Uprightness therefore is not the absence of error, but the refusal to continue in it. Yet many recoil from shame, calling it negative emotion. They prefer comfort to correction, and affirmation to truth. They misinterpret shame as an attack on identity when, in reality, shame is the invitation to reclaim true identity, one aligned with the light, purity, courage, honor, and truthfulness. Without shame, uprightness cannot be born. Without uprightness, no human being can rise spiritually. Without spiritual rising, all earthly effort becomes hollow. Thus shame remains the doorway to all genuine transformation. He who rejects shame rejects the possibility of becoming upright. Chapter 33. How shame restores boundaries and self-respect. A human being without boundaries becomes a weak, easily manipulated creature. They lose their voice, their individuality, and their spiritual dignity. Many today suffer not because others violated their boundaries, but because they no longer know they should have any. Shame is the inner mechanism that re-establishes the spiritual lines one must not cross. It tells the person, "This is not appropriate for you. This behavior is unworthy. This association degrades your inner purity. You must rise above this environment." Thus shame is the guardian of boundaries. It prevents the human being from allowing anything into their inner life that would distort their radiations or weaken their spiritual will. But shame also does what few understand. It restores self-respect. When one heeds true shame, one instantly feels a strengthening of the inner core. A dignity emerges, a recognition that one does not belong to the murky spheres of irresponsibility, impurity, or deceit. Self-respect does not come from achievements, titles, or praise. It arises the moment a person aligns themselves with the truth. False shame, however, created by fear of opinions or social pressure, destroys boundaries. It makes one act against conscience in order to fit in, be liked, or avoid criticism. Such shame must be cast away, for it weakens the soul. But true shame restores the walls of dignity, the fortress of purity, and the courage to say, "This is who I am, and I will not lower myself." A person who listens to true shame rises above confusion. A person who silences shame descends into inner fragmentation. Thus shame is not only corrective, it is restorative. Chapter 34. The connection between shame and authenticity. Authenticity is highly exalted in modern culture, yet few understand its true meaning. Authenticity is not being yourself as you are, for the human being as they are today is often distorted, misaligned, and driven by lower instincts. Authenticity is the state in which the human spirit expresses itself clearly, without interference from vanity, fear, imitation, or social conditioning. And shame is one of the most important forces that makes this authenticity possible. Whenever a person operates from false motives, trying to impress, manipulate, seduce, or conform, shame stirs within. It reveals the distance between the person's actions and their true inner nature. Shame exposes every form of hypocrisy, pretense, exaggeration, and moral compromise. It is the light insisting, "Be truthful. Be simple. Be real. Be aligned with your core." Shame unmasks what is artificial. It strips away the layers of false personality. It burns off the mist of self-deception. In the silence that follows, the authentic self emerges, not the intellectual persona or socially constructed identity, but the genuine spiritual expression that resonates with purity and truth. Thus shame is indispensable for anyone who desires true authenticity. Without shame, a person becomes emotionally blunt, morally loose, spiritually directionless, and inwardly hollow, though they may outwardly appear confident. Authenticity flowers only where shame has first purified. Chapter 35. Shame and the development of spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity is not measured by belief, ritual, or knowledge. It is measured by the human being's responsiveness to the laws of creation and their ability to orient themselves accordingly. Shame plays a central role in this development. A spiritually immature person reacts to shame with denial, defensiveness, justification, anger, projection onto others, escape into distractions, self-pity. But a spiritually maturing person reacts differently. They feel the sting of shame, pause, and quietly acknowledge, "There is truth in this. There is something I must correct. There is something I must rise above. There is a call from within to grow." Shame thus becomes a teacher, not a torment. The spiritually mature recognize shame as a signal for self-observation, a guidepost for inner adjustment, a purifier of motives, a reminder of higher purpose, a companion on the path of awakening. The Grail Message teaches that everything in creation serves the spiritual ascent of the human being. Shame, when rightly understood, is one of these aids. It marks the boundary between lower impulses and higher striving. It awakens the sleeping conscience. It strengthens the will to choose the good. Where shame is embraced, growth follows. Where shame is resisted, stagnation results. Where shame is absent, spiritual death begins. To feel shame is to remain reachable by the light. To grow through shame is to rise toward maturity. To honor shame is to become noble. Part 8. Practical liberation from false shame. Concrete tools for inner healing and freedom. Chapter 36. Identifying your shame patterns. Before liberation can begin, recognition must occur. No human being can correct what he has not first seen. In creation, every awakening begins with illumination. And illumination begins with truth, truth about oneself. False shame hides like a shadow behind the inner life. It forms patterns, predictable, repetitive movements of the soul that influence reactions, choices, and self-perception. These patterns can become so familiar that one may assume they are natural. But false shame is never natural. It is an intrusion, a distortion produced by wrong thinking, misplaced fear, or external pressure. To identify your shame pattern, you must observe yourself with quiet honesty. 1. Notice your first reaction in social situations. False shame often appears as shrinking back unnecessarily, feeling unworthy without cause, fearing what people will say, avoiding the right action, apologizing for simply existing. These reactions are not humility. They are wounds. 2. Observe the triggers. False shame has specific triggers tied to old experiences or conditioning. A tone of voice that reminds you of criticism. Environments where you felt judged. Tasks where you fear failure. People whose approval you desperately desire. Your pattern emerges where you repeatedly lose your natural freedom. 3. Observe your body. The soul expresses its distress through physical signs. Tightening of the chest. Shrinking posture. Avoiding eye contact. Sudden weakness. Compulsive smiling or laughter to hide. Your body reveals what the soul feels even before your mind interprets it. 4. Notice when you betray your inner conviction. Whenever you act against what you know is right only to please people, avoid rejection, or appear acceptable, you are under the grip of false shame. True shame protects you from wrongdoing. False shame pushes you away from what is right. 5. Ask, whose voice is this? False shame often carries another person's voice. A parent's harsh judgment. A teacher's ridicule. A religious leader's condemnation. Society's unrealistic expectation. A past abuser's imprint. It is not your voice. It is not the voice of your conscience. It is an echo, and the echo must be recognized before it can be dissolved. Once you identify your pattern, clarity begins. You are stepping out of darkness into light, and what was once unconscious now becomes visible. The radiations of truth begin their work. Chapter 37. Healing memories that carry false shame. False shame is rarely born in the present moment. It is carried, stored in the soul as impressions, often from childhood, relationships, failures, or moments of exposure. These impressions become radiational knots that bind the soul. Healing false shame means releasing these knots. 1. Remember, you are not reliving, you are liberating. The purpose of revisiting memories is not to dwell in pain but to untie what has imprisoned your feelings. Every painful memory carries a thought, a feeling, a judgment, and a false conclusion. The work is to dissolve the false conclusion. 2. Bring the memory into light. Sit quietly, breathe, and allow the memory to surface, not forcibly, but gently. Observe the scene objectively, as if watching from outside. You are not the child, the victim, or the old version of yourself anymore. You stand in the present, clothed in consciousness. 3. Identify the lie within the memory. False shame is always tied to a lie. I am not enough. I am inferior. I deserved the humiliation. My worth depends on approval. I caused the abuse. I am permanently stained by my past. These statements are radiational distortions. Creation recognizes no such verdict upon a striving human being. 4. Replace the lie with truth. Truth is simple, pure, liberating. I have dignity because I come from the spiritual realm. My worth is not dependent on human opinions. The wrong done to me does not define me. I am responsible only for my choices, not someone else's cruelty. I am permitted to grow, rise, and change. Truth unties the knot. 5. Bless the younger version of yourself. Place your inner gaze upon the child, youth, or adult version of yourself in the memory. Extend compassion. Speak strength into that moment. This radiational act sends healing backward and forward along your soul threads. 6. Release the memory. After illumination, let the memory dissolve like mist. You do not need to carry it anymore. The light has touched it. It can no longer bind you. This is spiritual cleansing, not through forgetting, but through understanding. Chapter 38. Radiational Tools for Emotional Cleansing. Human beings often try to heal shame through talk alone, but shame is not merely psychological, it is radiational. Therefore, healing must also be radiational. The Grail Message reveals the laws that govern these movements. Below are practical tools aligned with creation's rhythms. 1. The tool of inner stillness. False shame thrives in mental noise. True clarity arises in silence. Sit daily in stillness. Allow your thoughts to settle. When the intellect becomes quiet, your spirit begins to radiate. In that radiation, impurities loosen and fall away. 2. The tool of pure thought forms. Thoughts are forms, real, living forms. When you intentionally release thoughts of dignity, purity, self-respect, truth, gratitude, they move through your radiational field and dissolve dark accumulations. It is spiritual hygiene. 3. The tool of conscious breathing. Breathing affects radiations. Whenever shame arises, breathe deeply, slowly. Inhale with the awareness, I draw in clarity. Exhale with, I release falsehood. The breath is a spiritual ally. 4. The tool of light-filled visualization. Imagine your soul surrounded by white, luminous radiations. Imagine heaviness falling away. Imagine yourself standing upright, unashamed, and clear. This visualization is not fantasy. It is radiational alignment. 5. The tool of upright speech. Words purify. Speak aloud. I stand in truth. I rise above false shame. I respect myself. I am aligned with the light. Speech drives radiational movement. Creation responds. 6. The tool of purity in daily life. Every pure thought, gesture, or action brightens your aura. Every small act of integrity strengthens your inner footing. Purity is not moralism, it is radiational clarity. Chapter 39. Rebuilding self-worth from within. To overcome false shame, one must rebuild the foundation of healthy self-worth, not pride, not ego, but inner value rooted in truth. 1. Understand your true origin. You are spirit. You come from the luminous heights. Your value is not earned, it is intrinsic. This alone dismantles false shame at its root. 2. Build self-worth through right action. Every action aligned with the light strengthens your inner core. Honesty, reliability, discipline, consideration, courage, purity, simplicity. Self-worth grows through doing the right thing, not for applause, but because your spirit recognizes truth. 3. Separate identity from mistakes. A mistake is an event, not a definition. False shame tries to merge the two. True clarity separates them. 4. Cultivate a radiational environment. Surround yourself with uplifting words, wholesome music, clean habits, truthful people, constructive activities. Your environment nourishes or weakens your dignity. 5. Practice upright posture and presence. Stand, walk, and sit with respect for your own being. The body influences the soul. When posture rises, inner strength follows. 6. Accept the light's forgiveness. Once a wrong has been recognized and corrected, the light no longer holds it against you. You must also release it. Lingering in past errors is a form of pride, it assumes your judgment is higher than creation's. Self-worth grows when you accept mercy. Chapter 40. Rising above the fear of judgment. Fear of judgment is the root of most false shame. It is a fetter that binds millions. And yet, this fear rests on illusion. 1. Most people are too occupied with themselves. The individuals whose opinions you fear are busy battling their own flaws. Their judgment is neither final nor accurate. 2. Human opinions are radiationally weak. Only truth has lasting resonance in creation. Human opinions fluctuate like shadows. Why fear shadows? 3. You cannot control people's perception. Trying to manage how others see you is not humility, it is bondage. Release yourself. 4. Stand before the light, not before people. If your intention is upright, if your action is clean, if your conscience is at peace, then no human judgment has any weight. Only the light's evaluation matters. 5. Practice daily acts of courage. Courage grows through use. Speak your truth gently. Decline requests that violate your peace. Take responsibility without fear. Try new things without worrying about ridicule. Each courageous act shrinks the fear of judgment. 6. Embrace your humanity. To be human is to learn, to try, to fail, to rise again. There is no shame in imperfection. Shame arises only when one refuses to strive. 7. Reclaim your spiritual independence. When you no longer live under the tyranny of human approval, your soul becomes light, free, and strong. False shame dies. True dignity is reborn. You rise upright before your Creator, unafraid, unashamed, and aligned with truth. Part 9. The Purified Human Being and a Shame-Free Life. When shame has fulfilled its task. Chapter 41. What it means to become shameless in the right way. Humanity has long misunderstood the idea of being shameless. In everyday speech, shameless refers to a person who has lost all moral restraint, someone who no longer cares about right or wrong. But in the light of the Grail Message, there emerges an entirely different, far higher understanding, the state in which a human being has become so purified, so inwardly upright, that shame no longer needs to arise within them. This kind of shamelessness is not the absence of conscience, it is the victory of conscience. It is not moral numbness, it is moral maturity. It is not rebellion against the laws of creation, it is complete harmony with them. Shame was given to humanity as a safeguard, a radiational alarm that reacts whenever one's inner purity is threatened. When the human being is still immature, still struggling with impulses, desires, weaknesses, errors, and ego, shame must be active. It must warn, restrain, and guide. But when the person has cleansed their inner life, ordered their thoughts, refined their desires, and aligned their will with what is noble, shame naturally becomes silent. This silence is not emptiness. It is peace. True shamelessness, according to the light, means the absence of moral conflict because one's will is consistently oriented toward the good. The end of inner turbulence because the spiritual intuition and the intellect work together. Freedom from self-consciousness because one's actions are rooted in natural purity. Freedom from the fear of people because one stands anchored in the will of God. In this elevated state, shame has fulfilled its purpose. It is like a teacher who is no longer needed because the student has mastered the subject. It withdraws quietly, leaving behind a human being who walks in confidence, clarity, and dignity. This is the shamelessness of the pure, the noble, the spiritually mature. It is the shamelessness of one who is inwardly clean. It is the destiny of every human spirit. Chapter 42. The Radiations of Integrity and Natural Confidence. When a human being becomes inwardly purified, something profound happens, their radiations change. Every human spirit radiates, and these radiations either attract, repel, elevate, or burden. Shame itself is a radiational response, a reaction to disharmony. But when harmony is restored, and the human being lives truthfully, the radiations shift into a state of clarity and strength. These radiations create 1. Natural confidence. This is not pride, ego, or self-exaltation. It is the quiet assurance that arises from knowing one's motives are pure. Knowing one stands inside the laws of creation. Knowing one has nothing hidden, nothing to fear, nothing to pretend. This confidence is effortless. It is the serenity of one who is at peace with themselves. Such confidence cannot be learned intellectually. It is a spiritual state, born from integrity. 2. Integrity that speaks without words. Integrity radiates. A person of integrity commands respect without demanding it, earns trust without asking for it, creates peace simply by their presence. Integrity forms a protective radiational shield around the individual, shielding them from manipulation, deception, and inner instability. It makes their path straight. 3. A magnet for what is upright. The purified human being attracts similar radiations. Opportunities, friendships, work, responsibilities, and helpers that resonate with their inner order begin to gather around them. The laws respond. Here, the absence of shame is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is the quiet glow of a human being who has finally aligned with the light. Chapter 43. Living without pretense, fear, or hypocrisy. The majority of people today live behind masks, sometimes many masks. People pretend to be confident, pretend to be strong, pretend to be holy, pretend to be unbothered, pretend to be happy, pretend to be successful. This constant play acting fragments the soul, damages the conscience, and creates layers of false shame. But the purified person has no need of masks. 1. No pretense. They have become inwardly transparent. They speak the truth simply. They show themselves as they truly are, not as society demands or expects. There is no double life, no hidden motives, no secret corruption. This transparency is not naivety, it is strength. 2. No fear. Fear fades because the purified person anchors their life in what is real, the laws of creation. Fear thrives only where there is dishonesty, inner disorder, or attachment to false values. When these are gone, fear collapses. 3. No hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is impossible for the person whose inner and outer life have become aligned. Their words and actions match. Their thoughts and feelings are unified. Their conscience and their choices flow in the same direction. This is freedom. Where false shame produces hiding, pretending, shrinking, and self-protection, true purification produces openness, courage, presence, and authenticity. This is the life humanity was meant to live. Chapter 44. Spiritually mature relationships without shame games. Most human relationships today, marriages, friendships, families, workplaces, are filled with shame-based dynamics. People manipulate each other through guilt. People hide their weaknesses. People fear being exposed. People punish each other emotionally. People compare, compete, or control. These are the shame games of an immature humanity. But spiritually mature relationships function differently. 1. Honesty without humiliation. The purified person speaks the truth, but not to wound, rather, to uplift. Their honesty comes from love, not superiority. 2. Transparency without fear. They can admit mistakes without collapsing. They can ask for help without shame. They can express their needs without fear of judgment. 3. Boundaries without aggression. Clear boundaries arise naturally from inner dignity, not from anger or fear. 4. Responsibility without blame. The purified person acknowledges their actions. They do not manipulate, accuse, or hide behind excuses. 5. Respect without conditions. They recognize the spiritual core within each human being. This produces deep respect, even during conflict or disagreement. Such relationships are rare today, but they will become the foundation of the coming humanity, relationships grounded in clarity, truth, and inner purity, free from shame-based toxicity. Chapter 45. Your new radiational identity, clean, clear, upright. A purified human being becomes a different creature altogether. Not externally, but internally, in their radiations, in their essence, in the way they move through the world. This new radiational identity is marked by 3 qualities. 1. Clean. There is no hidden dirt in the soul, no deception, no secret immorality, no self-serving motives. The person is clean in thought, desire, and conduct. Their inner world is orderly. 2. Clear. Clarity replaces confusion. Decisions are straightforward. The conscience is bright. Intuition flows without obstruction. The person's presence creates clarity for others. They do not confuse, entangle, or darken any situation. They illuminate it. 3. Upright. Uprightness is the natural posture of the spirit aligned with the light. It is the human being standing in their full created dignity. Uprightness means you walk straight because nothing bends you inward. You stand firm because nothing shakes your foundation. You look forward because nothing haunts you from behind. This is the destiny of the human spirit, to live free from shame, not because they killed shame, but because they fulfilled it. The human being becomes a vessel of light. This is the end of shame. This is the beginning of true humanity. Conclusion. The return to purity, dignity, and inner clarity. A final call to spiritual responsibility. The journey through the nature, function, misuse, distortion, healing, and noble purpose of the feeling of shame brings us to a final, unavoidable realization: man has lost himself because he has lost purity. When purity dims, dignity collapses. When dignity collapses, the inner clarity required for healthy shame disappears. Humanity then becomes either excessively sensitive to false shame or dangerously hardened in shamelessness. In the light of the Grail Message, shame is revealed not as a moral curse or psychological pathology, but as a living spiritual indicator, a radiational response that tells the human spirit: here, something is not right. It is not meant to accuse, paralyze, or destroy. It is meant to awaken, redirect, purify, and elevate. Humanity's present crisis: a world without true shame. Humanity today is wounded not because shame exists, but because true shame is often ignored. Wrongdoing no longer alarms the inner being. Many feel no discomfort in impurity, dishonor, or deceit. False shame dominates. People fear opinions more than truth, appearances more than reality, crowds more than their conscience. Shame has been weaponized. Religions have used it to control, societies to manipulate, families to punish, cultures to conform. Psychology has tried to eliminate it altogether. Mistaking true shame for emotional toxicity, modern theories amputated a spiritual nerve. Thus humanity stands confused, oscillating between shamelessness and hypersensitivity, lacking the balance that comes only through the illumination of spiritual laws. The call back to purity. Purity is not naivety. Purity is alignment with the will of the Creator, a life governed by truth, honor, reverence, and clarity. When purity is restored, shame becomes a gentle guide, not a tormentor. The conscience becomes a trustworthy compass. Human relationships become clean, upright, and peaceful. The spirit walks unburdened, truthful, and free. The dignity that arises from purification. Dignity is not pride. Dignity is the natural radiance of a spirit standing in truth. It is the quiet authority of one who no longer hides, no longer pretends, no longer fears the light. Through the right understanding and purification of shame, the soul regains self-respect. The will regains firmness. The inner life regains order. The radiations grow bright. This dignity is essential for the coming time, because the Creator does not support anything impure. Only the upright, the clear, and the inwardly clean will stand securely in the new order forming under the pressure of purification. Clarity, the crown of inner awakening. Clarity is the end result of the work this book invites you to do. It is clarity that lets you feel true shame instantly. It is clarity that dissolves false shame effortlessly. It is clarity that helps you recognize your path, your mistakes, your duties. And clarity becomes possible only when the human being willingly exposes himself to the light, honestly, reverently, without excuses. A final call to responsibility. Having been shown what shame truly is, what it is not, how it functions, how it is distorted, and how it is healed, the responsibility now lies with you, the reader. You must choose to awaken, rather than remain numb. To purify, rather than justify. To listen to the conscience, rather than the crowd. To cultivate dignity, rather than live in pretense. Shame is not your enemy. It is one of the Creator's gifts. A guardian, a purifier, a teacher, a light. If you embrace its true nature and discard its false shadows, you will regain the lost nobility of the human spirit. Epilogue. The coming purification and the restoration of natural shame. A world where only what is pure can stand before the light. The world stands on the threshold of a great purification, an event foreseen in all sacred traditions, but explained with incomparable clarity in the Grail Message. This purification is not merely physical, it is radiational. It reveals, intensifies, exposes, and separates. In such a time, the feeling of shame will regain its rightful place in creation. Why? Because in the stronger light now permeating the world, all impurity becomes painfully visible. All dishonesty becomes unbearable. All pretense becomes impossible. All inner distortions begin to burn. Humanity will be forced, willingly or unwillingly, to feel again. The numbness that protected wrongdoing will evaporate. The false shame generated by fear of others will dissolve. But true shame will flare up sharply, driving many to sudden awakening. The return of natural shame. Natural shame is effortless. It is the quiet recoil of the spirit from impurity. It protects dignity, preserves purity, and sustains inner order. When creation intensifies its radiations, as is happening now, this natural shame becomes active again. People who once felt nothing will suddenly recognize their errors. People who were once proud of their shamelessness will feel exposed. People who hid behind intellectual arguments will discover the limits of self-deception. Only what is pure will endure. In the coming order, honor will replace manipulation. Truth will replace image-making. Responsibility will replace blame. Purity will replace corruption. Dignity will replace shamelessness. And shame, true shame, will once again serve as a guardian of purity. Appendix. Practical exercises, reflections, and radiational techniques. These tools help the reader not only understand but experience the purification of shame. 1. The Shame Truth Reflection Exercise. Sit quietly with a notebook. Ask yourself, what wrong action or attitude do I feel ashamed of? Is this shame because of truth or because of people? What correction does my conscience point toward? Write without excuses. Clarity begins with honesty. 2. Radiational Cleansing Technique. Sit upright. Close your eyes. Imagine a column of light descending from above. Breathe calmly. Let the light shine into the emotion of shame. Say inwardly, let only what is true remain. Let all falsehood dissolve. Repeat as needed. 3. Distinguishing true and false shame. A simple test. Ask yourself, does this shame point me toward betterment? Does this shame appear only when others are watching? Does this shame protect purity? Does this shame arise from fear, not conscience? 4. Rebuilding dignity through daily conduct. Each evening, reflect on, where was I truthful? Where did I act cowardly? Where did I hide? Where did I stand upright? Dignity grows from small daily acts. 5. Radiational posture of confidence. Stand upright. Shoulders relaxed. Chest open. Feet firmly planted. Say inwardly, I stand in the light. This posture aligns the body with the radiations of integrity and quiet confidence.